Great. So I have a special treat for you all today. In lieu of a regular lecture where I shout at my laptop alone in my room for an hour, I'm going to be interviewing one of the co-authors of the book that we've been reading for class, The Misinformation Age. I've got Cailin O'Connor from University of California, Santa Barbara on the line. And I'm going to be asking her some questions about the book. Welcome, Cailin.
Thanks. I'm actually at UC Irvine.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I recognize these places are far away and relatively close to each other. So
no offense to Irvine. Cool. So the book has a bunch of interesting chapters. I'm going to skip over the introduction and just get started right away with some stuff from chapter 1. And in particular, I kind of want to pit you against Hugo Mercier a little bit. I don't know if you've had a chance to see some of his recent stuff, like the book Not Born Yesterday, or his stuff about epistemic vigilance.
I did actually. He and I were pitted against each other in a debate.
Oh, okay.
So we're on a track others went on before.
Okay, so you're prepared for this. So one of the sort of epistemic vigilance mechanisms that he says is that people use, and which is rational to use, is something like plausibility checking. So if somebody tells you something that goes against what you already believe, then you're sort of justified in rejecting it out of hand. And that seems like a reasonable thing to do. In Bayesian terms, I guess that would be something like taking your strong priors into account. But you discuss an interesting example in chapter 1 about the ozone layer, where there were readings that were coming in that were so wildly implausible that they got discounted. And it seems like, with the world being an uncertain place, and maybe because of things like climate change now moving the goalposts, what used to be a once in a 1,000-year flood is happening every 3 years. Maybe our plausibility checking mechanisms are no longer as reliable as we would expect them to be, or as they used to be in the past. I'm wondering what you think about that, and how we might handle that problem without just sort of throwing our hands in the air and saying, I have no idea what to believe anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a really interesting and difficult thing, because of course everyone has to do plausibility checking. You can't believe everything you hear. Neither can you independently research everything you hear in perfect ways. And there are cases where, you might get information or evidence that like literally can't be researched in some way. So like this brand new ozone layer evidence, it's not like they could just go check the internet or ask someone like, was this right? Or, should we throw out this data? So you have to plausibility check. Of course, on the other hand, sometimes you develop systems of beliefs that are so systematically wrong that plausibility checking starts dependably leading you in the wrong direction, right? So if you go down the rabbit hole in some conspiracy theory, or you develop a system of beliefs that says science is generally not trustworthy, or physicians as a group are trying to mislead me, or, in some countries, my government is trying to, just harm me, you can end up where plausibility checking is leading you to throw away good beliefs and evidence rather than bad beliefs and evidence. So it's not like, I wouldn't say that just generally it's a practice that is going to be beneficial or harmful. It sort of depends on the context, right? That you kind of have to do it. So with respect to this question or idea about like climate change, things changing, cases where evidence is so weird that your plausibility checks don't work, there are lots of cases like that in the history of science, and some of them go one way and some of them go another. Sometimes someone gets some anomalous data and it turns out to be an anomaly. Sometimes someone gets anomalous data and it turns out to actually be data that's pushing you in the right direction, as with this ozone data. And, it seems to me that in the ozone case, people did exactly what would be the right thing. They did another check of a different sort of data that they could depend on more, and then updated their beliefs on that so they could change their beliefs in the end. Maybe at first they don't change their beliefs when they see the first set of data, but when they go investigate more, find out more, then they do, right? And so there's a process by which you might have a small belief change where when you get some anomalous data and you think, well, maybe that could be true. And then you go actually do more research into it. And I would say that would tend to be the right way to go about it.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I guess it can also make us doubt our own competence. Like I think about back in high school when I would do physics experiments. We all knew what the right answer was supposed to be. So we would sometimes fudge our data because we actually got graded solution with our experiments. And it would be sort of unreasonable to say like, oh, this high schooler tried to do an experiment and they overturned Newtonian mechanics. Right? If it doesn't accord with what we know from the physicists, then we say the student's wrong, rather than that there's an anomaly here that has overturned the theory. And I guess that suggests to me that we need to be careful about plausibility checking and sort of think more about who counts as an expert, who might have skills and expertise that are not being recognized, because nowadays it's easy enough to claim expertise, and there are plenty of people with PhDs who engage in like epistemic trespassing, where they might be an expert in one field and then they go blathering about some other field where they really don't have competence and shouldn't be saying anything.
Yeah. I mean, so it seems like, in your ideal world, if you're an ideal Bayesian, you have these many sets of beliefs about, what sort of meta beliefs, bigger beliefs about the competence of people producing certain sorts of data, the competence or the accuracy of certain sorts of tests. And then you use that to ask, like, how much should I trust this data? How much should I change my beliefs on the basis of it? How much should I trust this person's claim or change my beliefs on the basis of them? And all of that would go into what you do when you get data that somehow doesn't fit with your world view, right? So in your case, in the high school physics experiment, it makes a lot of sense to be like, we're probably the ones who are wrong. Something I do with, like, I started doing this with all my modeling work a few years ago after someone found some mistakes in papers I had published, is having an independent person on like the co-authorship team replicate all the modeling work. So maybe a student does it first and then I do it, or I do it first and then I have a student do it. And sometimes it happens that we get data that's different, and then we sit down, and in that case, there's no clear sort of first reason to think one of us would be right or wrong, right? We just know something's gone wrong, and then we delve in, we figure out what's going wrong, we find, what we've maybe done differently. Did someone make a mistake? Did we just make different assumptions in the model? And then through that process, like, develop data and a model that's more dependable. And yeah, it's sort of, I don't know, there's some similarity to the ozone thing there too. You dig in more when something goes wrong.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. It reminds me a little bit of this idea of adversarial collaboration that arose out of the replication crisis in psychology. So what started happening was like all these famous results like ego depletion couldn't be reproduced outside of the lab that they were originally done in. And it wasn't due to fraud, it was just due to way too many degrees of freedom in the design and analysis of the studies by the original researchers. So initially, there were people just saying like, look, we couldn't reproduce your work, you must be wrong. And then you end up with this kind of people being at loggerheads with the famous old full professor saying, well, I must be right because I'm at Harvard, and you must be wrong because you're a grad student or an early career researcher who just isn't competent to reproduce my fancy results. So this idea of an adversarial collaboration came up, where it was like the two sides sat down together and agreed upon, like, okay, this would actually work as a test that we would both believe in, regardless of which result came out. It sounds like you're doing something kind of similar, maybe not quite as adversarial, with your own collaborators.
Yeah, I think it also relates to these kind of many lab papers that some social psychologists and others are doing, where we get 4 co-authorship teams, and then we all agree ahead of time we're going to do this experiment, and then we all do it, and then we see were the results all the same, as a kind of answer to the replication crisis. That's like, it doesn't have the adversarial model, but it has the model of independent creation of data, with the idea that if they all show the same thing, there's some kind of robustness check there for ways small changes could mess things up. Yeah,
we actually did participated in one of those last year. We ended up collecting data from something like 45,000 participants in 86 countries. And the co-authorship team ended up being over 100 people. It was pretty wild. But as you say, it really does show robustness, because we actually found essentially the same result in all 86 countries.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. That one I'll update my beliefs on.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess one other thing to maybe think about, given the rise of uncertainty, is something like the precautionary principle that's implemented in the European Union and also sometimes in other countries. So you might think like, well, given high uncertainty, we need to plan for sort of worst case scenarios and not assume that because something is implausible given our prior beliefs that it can't happen.
I feel like with COVID, a lot of policy recommendations have tried to follow something like that. We don't know that X thing will stop the spread of COVID at this point, but it could, and given how bad the spread is, let's try X thing, even though it's not like we've had time to sit down and do a random control trial on masking in the beginning, and then the distance of social distancing, like all of these different principles.
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable. I guess one last thing that I found interesting, because I've done some work in philosophy of technology, was that in the ozone example, if I recall correctly, it wasn't even that people looked at the data and threw it out because it was implausible. It was like registering as like at the measurement location itself as bad data and not getting passed along. And that's interesting, because it shows that like plausibility can get built into an apparatus or into an algorithm. Like if you have your speedometer on your car only goes up to 60 miles an hour, then if you're traveling at 80, you'll never be able to tell. And if your ozone measurement device, only goes up to a certain level or down below a certain level, then you can't even detect that.
Yeah, that's right. So our prior beliefs in this case, right, it was a system meant to clean data. Like, it's not going to show you stuff outside this range, because stuff outside that range must just be some kind of measurement error. And so, right, our prior beliefs determine what measurements we end up getting in such a way that in that case, if they hadn't been looking carefully, those measurements would continue to confirm prior beliefs.
Yeah, cool. So let's move on a little bit. Can you just give us a brief sort of introduction to Bayes' rule and how Bayes' rule can get implemented in artificial agents in networks? Because this is a recording for an epistemology class, and I can't assume that everyone already knows all this math.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, like we've been talking about Bayesianism already. So hopefully that's not too confusing. So Bayes' rule, it's a staple of probability theory. It says, it starts with this assumption: we're going to represent our beliefs with numbers between 0 and 1. And sometimes there are more robust kind of structures of how we represent our beliefs, but that's the basic idea. So if I think there's a 60% chance it's going to rain tomorrow, my credence in it raining is 0.6. So we represent our beliefs as probabilities. And then Bayes' rule tells us, given certain kinds of evidence and the relationship of that evidence to hypotheses about the world, how should we change our beliefs? So maybe my belief is 60% that it's going to rain tomorrow. And then I watch the weather and the weatherman says 100% chance of rain tomorrow. So this gives me information about what's going to happen tomorrow, and I can use that to update my belief. Now, generally, the weatherman is pretty truth tracking, so my credence should go up if I use Bayes' rule. There's specifics about how to do it. So in particular, I have to know, if it is going to rain tomorrow, how likely is it that the weatherman says 100% chance of rain today? If it's not going to rain tomorrow, how likely is that? And then I use that to do a calculation that then should change my probability in an ideally rational way. And one of the, the sort of important things to know about Bayes' rule is it's called ideally rational, basically because if you don't use it, you can open yourself up to these things called Dutch books. And this is something that can happen to you if you have incoherent probabilistic beliefs. And basically, they are a series of bets where you will be willing to take them all and you're guaranteed to lose money. So people say, like, why should you use Bayes' rule? Well, it's pragmatic, because if you don't use it, your beliefs will be incoherent in this way. Someone could take advantage of you. And if you do use it, you protect yourself from being taken advantage of that way. Basically, your beliefs are the best they can be.
Cool. Yeah, I had to look up the etymology of Dutch book because I was very confused by it. It has nothing to do with Spinoza or something. It actually refers to like a bookie.
Yeah, like a book,
making bets.
yeah,
and I guess,
the book is
yeah,
the set of bets that you would take, and then
yeah. And I guess the Dutch were very good at this.
yeah.
They also invented short selling.
Well, they're Dutch. I mean, there's all
Financial innovations.
finance and probability, and yeah.
Okay, cool. So that's how we should sort of update our beliefs in light of evidence. But that's something you could do sort of just as an individual if you are observing the world without interacting with other people. And the stuff that you do in the book also involves sort of taking in testimony from other agents. So can you explain how we go from the individual sort of just taking in evidence from the natural world to this more complex idea of like a network of agents that both sample the world and listen to each other, at least to some extent?
Yeah, and this is good to discuss in a epistemology class for philosophy, because I think if you look at the history of philosophy, the focus when we're talking about epistemology is really on the individual agent, the individual rational agent. We're all humans, and what makes us special is we have these big brains, and they allow us to think about the world rationally and come to rational beliefs about the world. One of the big points in our book is that this isn't really how we do it. We instead use all these heuristics and depend a lot on our social environment to get new information and beliefs. In fact, that's where the vast majority of factual beliefs we have come from other people around us, rather than something like direct observation or evidence from the world. So there's a couple things here. One is that none of us are actually Bayesians. That's this kind of ideal model of learning. And in fact, when we look at the reality, there's all these truths about the way we learn, like that we're social, that we're not Bayesian, that we have different biases, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. Another thing is to recognize that if we're thinking about ideal rationality being ideal Bayesians, we have to think about how that works in a social context, right? So in what ways, what kinds of information do we get from our social environment? What does that mean for us as learners? How would we ideally learn about things given that we're in social environments? And all of those questions, as we argue, in at least in part in the book, are kind of different than the question of like, how would I be a Bayesian if I were just kind of alone over here by myself?
Yeah, so the way you do that is by having the agents update their beliefs based on the testimony of others. So I guess already in the example of the weatherman saying that it's going to rain tomorrow, that's an example where you conditionalize not on looking out the window or taking your own measurements of your barometer, but by just listening to someone else.
I would say, so I would draw a slight distinction because there are different kinds of models you can do when you're looking at social networks and learning. And in our models, I would say we focus more on ones where it's not just the testimony of others, it's the fact that you're getting evidence shared by others. So in most of the models we look at, this sort of paradigm is something like, you tell me about evidence that was gathered from the world. You also can think about testimony, and I would think of that as something slightly different. That would be like you saying, I don't think it's going to rain tomorrow, or I think there's a 100% chance, or here's my credence that it's going to rain tomorrow. So at least that's the way I usually think about it, that there's testimony and then there's evidence sharing, and they're slightly different.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I guess I was thinking of Eric Olson's version of this network modeling, because in his, I think it's not evidence sharing, but
credences.
Sharing credences.
Just say like my credence is 0.5, and then
Right.
others update on that. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's a helpful distinction. I guess one question that someone might immediately raise is like, okay, well, you just admitted that humans aren't actually Bayesian, perfectly rational Bayesian agents, that we use all kinds of shortcuts and heuristics and rules of thumb. What is the point of a model that is unrealistic in this way? What's the point of a kind of idealized model?
Yeah, so there's actually a really important role that this idealization is playing in most of the models that we look at and some other people look at in this literature. And what, part of what we're doing is something like this, setting up agents who learn as Bayesians for the most part, and then putting them into a social context and asking what happens next. And the reason that's a useful thing to do is that people often make arguments like this. The reason we see polarization is X kind of irrationality, X kind of reasoning bias. Or the reason we see failures to learn is that people are dumb in this way. And part of what these models often show is like, okay, people don't have to be that dumb to have these systematic failures in various social environments. So you can be a pretty good reasoner and be in the wrong social environment and come up with pretty bad beliefs at the end. Or you can have a whole group of people who are pretty good reasoners, maybe modulo some little types of biases, and they polarize really dependably, despite the fact that they're decent reasoners. And so it's a way of showing not necessarily that everyone is rational in these ways, but that there are other explanations for these kinds of systematic failures. And in particular, if we're thinking about like social groups, that there might be these ways they really do fail, even when people are reasoning decently well.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. I think in a separate book, you call it a how minimally explanation. And the idea is something like, you don't have to assume that people are messed up in all kinds of laughable ways in order to explain how certain problems might arise. So even if you're very good at reasoning, you can end up dependably with false beliefs or with bad credences.
Yeah. So for example, when we do this discussion of chronic Lyme disease, I think having this kind of model with this kind of explanation is kind of useful, because what you see in the real world is this situation where you have groups of researchers who are vehemently opposed to each other. They have these really different beliefs. So one group is like chronic Lyme is real, it really hurts patients, we need to keep treating them with antibiotics. The other group is like chronic Lyme is not a real thing, long-term antibiotics don't do anything for it, treating these patients is really unethical. Both groups accuse the other side of all sorts of ethical harms and biases and financial influence. And part of the accusation seemed to be something along these lines, like, if you have come up with these beliefs, you must be financially motivated rather than epistemically motivated. And we at least want to use our models to say, like, well, maybe not. There really could be situations where you have people who are trying to learn the truth, who are using data to do that, who are decent epistemic agents, but who end up deeply polarized in this way. And then once they do, and they start mistrusting the other group and not accepting evidence from them, they really could end up polarized without these kinds of like financial influences or people committing fraud. And so, I don't know, maybe in this case, there are a lot of bad actors and people are committing fraud and it's kind of secretly really bad. But part of the argument is like, it doesn't have to be that. It could be a lot of actually epistemically motivated people who nonetheless end up polarized this way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it sort of points to two ways in which the traditional analyses of philosophy, analyses of knowledge in philosophy are problematic. So one is that they're very individualistic and don't take into account groups. And that means that we can end up with situations where like the individuals are all doing the right thing, but the group ends up with a wrong consensus. Or you could have situations where some individuals are actually being unreasonably stubborn, but that actually helps the group. Doesn't help them as individuals, but it does help the group. So that's one distinction. And then the other is the sort of temporal dimension to knowledge. So most analyses of knowledge you see in the epistemology literature are sort of a single time slice. It's just like and S knows that P if and only if blah 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 blah. But what this sort of suggests is that we should instead think more about the sort of diachronic process of inquiry rather than the time-stamped state of knowledge. And that process of inquiry doesn't really have like a horizon on it. It can be ongoing sort of indefinitely, which is related to this idea from Lakatos that there's no such thing as instant rationality. Like it could be that you have reasonable beliefs given your evidence today, and then you have to change your beliefs tomorrow because more evidence comes in.
Yeah, and I think people try to have recently been trying to engage in public information campaigns about the workings of science that say if a scientific consensus was wrong at some point and then it changed, that doesn't necessarily mean anything's going wrong. That's how inquiry works in a lot of cases. You have some state of evidence, you have some state of investigation, you develop reasonable beliefs on the basis of those, but then you might get further evidence, you might develop new tests, you might find things out, and then you change your beliefs.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I want to return to this point you've made about polarization a couple of times now. One of the interesting and surprising things in the modeling literature is that networks of ideally rational agents almost always end up polarizing, even though they're all sort of updating their beliefs using Bayes' law. And you might think something must be going wrong here if ideally rational agents are splitting on something when they've had lots of opportunities to inquire and share evidence. Can you maybe explain to us a little bit why this puzzling result keeps cropping up in the literature?
Well, so I don't know that I would say that the models show that good agents almost always polarize. I think, there are a bunch of different sets of results that show like add this factor to a set of to a group learning together. If you add that kind of minimal factor, you get polarization out pretty dependably. And I mean, the thing I would tend to take away from this modeling literature is something like there's a bunch of different things that can cause polarization, a lot of them that could be at work in the real world. And, the fact that so many things can, and you can have otherwise reasonable agents, means it's like not that hard to polarize actually. Yeah, so that's more what the kind of takeaway.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. So what sorts of things tend to cause polarization then?
Yeah, so let me give just like a rundown. So one is that you have belief updating where you don't trust evidence from people who don't share your beliefs. So if you say like, I believe in climate change, you don't believe in climate change, and if neither of us is willing to trust evidence that the other shares because our beliefs are too far apart, then you get polarized communities. So, basing mistrust on non-shared beliefs, which is something that we think people really do in a lot of cases.
And that's like the plausibility checking thing all over again, in a way.
It's a little different because in this case, your mistrust is based on the source rather than the plausibility of the claim. So it's like, do I think you are a bad source rather than do I think the claim you've made is implausible?
Right. I guess there's bound to be a connection between those two, because if you think that someone is an unreliable source, then you're unlikely to think that the evidence they're sharing is much good. And if you think that someone always shares unreliable evidence, then you start to discount them as a source.
I think they're a bad source. Yeah. So in reality, those are probably going to go together. But you can show in models that if you pull them apart, just I don't trust you if you hold different beliefs is enough. Even if you share information that would accord with the things I believe, if I don't trust you, we can end up polarized. And we can end up polarized if I don't trust claims that are too different from my own beliefs. So if I engage in some kind of confirmation bias, you also get polarization in models. So that's a kind of second thing, which is actually different, even though, as you point out, in reality, they probably often go together. Here's a third thing. If you have conformity bias, so that people want to conform with those in their small cliques and in groups, that can cause polarization separate from either of these other kinds of learning patterns.
And conformity bias can be pragmatically rational as well. I mean, if you are going to get sort of kicked out of your community for being a heretic, then sometimes it makes sense to go with the flow, even though you think that the belief involved is questionable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a ton of pragmatic sense, even for much lower stakes things than being kicked out of your community. So like, I sometimes give an example of a time that I conformed, like I was hanging out with another mom outside dance class, and she was saying something like that she had brain surgery, and it turns out the inside of your skull is surprisingly rough. And I said something like, it's rough? How weird. Who would ever think? And I was about to say that your skull would evolve to be rough on the inside. And she was like, that God would make us that way. And I was like, right. But like in that case, I'm faced with a decision. Like, am I going to be like, well, I believe in evolution rather than, sort of creationism? Or am I just going to go along with it? And like the payoffs to me for disagreeing with her are really poor. The payoffs for agreeing are much better. I'm going to have to see her every week for years. And so like, why am I good? What's the payout to me to try to contradict what she's saying, right? So yeah, conformity bias can make a ton of sense, depending on the situation. And that again on its own can generate polarization without the other factors. And so there's a third mechanism for polarization. A fourth mechanism for polarization, and some of these are things I'll just mention that like current students I have are working on. So the confirmation bias, the student Nathan Gabriel has been doing cool modeling on that. And the next thing I'll mention, the student Jeannie Wu has been doing. So she was interested in the idea of epistemic injustice, where one group like ignores the testimony or evidence or whatever from another group systematically. So maybe these are racial groups, and white people in the US ignore the kind of statements and evidence coming from Native American people in the US. She shows that that kind of ignoring can generate polarization, where you have one group with systematically different beliefs than another group. That is sort of, again, related to this, like, you know, do I trust you as a source question? And here's another reason I might not trust you as a source. So those are just a handful of things. You can also get polarization from like systematically different sources of information, right? If you listen to systematically different news sources, you can end up with systematically different beliefs. And again, you could be learning in a very reasonable way from those sources, but if they are giving you different information, you're just in different social environments, informational environments, and so develop different beliefs.
Yeah, that's really interesting and a bit scary, to be honest. One of the other mechanisms that, if I recall, you've actually written about is this idea of like factionalization, where if we're already polarized about one proposition, then we'll tend to polarize about other ones as well. Can you explain how that happens?
Yeah, so the models we developed to talk about that were extensions of these models where we say like, okay, I'm not going to trust you if we have really different beliefs. And then we asked, well, what if we have beliefs in different arenas? You know, what if we have beliefs about climate change? And then we also have beliefs about the safety of vaccines. And the question was, are you going to get your polarization lining up into groups where the groups then have these systematically different beliefs, but then shared in-group beliefs, right? And so we showed, you know, if you already have polarization over climate change and then beliefs about vaccines start developing, you can get the new beliefs kind of glomming on to the already existing groups, where it's because these groups already don't trust each other. One becomes like the pro and one the anti-vax, you know. So yeah, that's same mechanism, slightly different kind of polarization.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it sort of reflects things that you see in the real world. Like if I tell you that someone from the US lives in a rural area, drives a pickup truck, and never eats sushi, you can probably guess a whole bunch of other things about them, just based on those three seemingly, at least logically unconnected things. So it does seem that like we're seeing in the US, but also in other places, polarization along quite a large number of dimensions.
Yeah, and some of these dimensions are belief things, and then some, as you're hinting at now, have to do with lifestyle choices. And so other people have written papers kind of analyzing how these lifestyle choices start to, you know, glom into groupie type things, right? Where whether you wear North Face jackets predicts whether you drink lattes or whatever.
Right.
No, it's
Right.
never perfect in reality, but you do get some kind of correlation and predictive power.
Yeah, I mean, and these lifestyle choices end up influencing what kinds of information and evidence are available, or what sources seem credible to people, right? So if your lifestyle involves only listening to talk radio and Fox News, then you have one set of information coming in. And if you instead read the New York Times, then you have a different set of information coming in.
And then you can also have the development of something we haven't really talked about yet, which is in and out group psychology, where you start to have an us and them type of mentality and start to, you know, see the expression of these really deep-seated psychological tendencies in humans to want to be part of an in-group, want to, you know, have biases against their out-group, biases towards their in-group, and do things to signal in-group membership. And all of that, I think, we don't really talk very much about that in the Misinformation Age. And it's a huge lacuna in that book, because of course that stuff is very meaningful and very important in determining, sort of when polarization happens and how it happens and what beliefs people adopt. I mean, we talk about conformity, which is like a little bit there, but it ignores other things about our kind of in and out group psychology.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism, but obviously you can't cover everything in the book. I mean, one thing that I've been doing a lot of research on recently is more like affective polarization. So it's like I have strongly positive associations with my in-group and strongly negative associations with my out-group, which is more like emotional or affective rather than related to credences.
Yeah.
But again, that's likely to interact with and exacerbate belief polarization as well.
Yeah, that's right. And beliefs become like signals about group membership. You know, your statement of a belief becomes a signal to others. I am part of your group. And so, you know, beliefs, when people state them, sometimes have different meanings. Sometimes they're statements of like their real literal beliefs. Sometimes they're just saying, I want you to think I'm part of your group, or that I'm part of this group.
Yeah, this is an interesting wrinkle that Neil Levy has been emphasizing for a while now. So with a lot of sort of psychological and polling data, you just sort of ask people to report their beliefs. And it could be, you know, whether they accept conspiracy theories or whether they think that people should wear a mask during a pandemic, or whether they are going to get vaccinated, or whether they accept, you know, misinformation. And Neil has argued, I think pretty plausibly, that sometimes what we see in this data is like expressive responding. So when people say, I think that there's a satanic cabal of pedophiles that secretly runs the United States, and that Donald Trump is going to take them all down. What they're saying is
they
not
literally think that, or are they?
They're not really expressing a belief. They're just saying, I'm part of this group.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, so one thing we claim in the book is that you should be more likely to see that kind of stuff in cases where beliefs the rubber never meets the road, where the beliefs don't really hurt you. That saying, I don't believe in evolution, like that's a great place to hold a false belief. It's not going to hurt. It doesn't matter if you believe in evolution or not. You're not going to
make a biologist.
Right. But generally, you're not going to make any bad life choices. It's just not going to make a big difference. Even climate change, like it's going to make a difference, but it's pretty divorced from your sort of day-to-day consequences in your life. You're not meeting special consequences by not believing in climate change right now. So one thing that's been so weird during the COVID-19 pandemic is the fact that people have been willing to kind of put their money where their mouth is with these beliefs that can hurt them right away and pretty dramatically, right? So a friend of my family is literally prone on oxygen right now because he put in anti-vax beliefs where his, he put them to the test. And so this would have been a case where we, in the book, like having written it, I would have predicted that like when it came to like masking, vaccination, when there's like a real pandemic, social distancing, all these things, that people would not have used these as signals of group membership or, a way that you wouldn't get polarization over these because the consequences are so serious. But instead we did. And it was like, that was very surprising to me. If anything, I was like, well, I guess maybe our kind of theses about the importance of social stuff and knowledge should have been stronger. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what I said to Neil Levy about this stuff was like, yeah, it might be expressive responding, but refusing to wear a mask is also a kind of expressive responding. It's a way of signaling, that you're you're with Trump or something. And, maybe it's just that people are bad at doing the probabilities, or maybe it's just we underestimate how important to our psychologies, like that we're willing to risk our lives to signal that we belong. Who's to say? Maybe if it's important enough to you, it is worth that risk.
Yeah, maybe the social payoffs are enough that sometimes it is worth it.
Well, that's depressing. Well, so speaking of groups and connectivity, one of the interesting and maybe surprising, if you're not already familiar with this literature, results that you mentioned is that like more connectivity, denser connections in a network are sometimes actually bad for group outcomes. And you might have thought like, well, if everyone's actually just trying to learn the truth and we're not dealing with all this kind of affective polarization stuff, everyone's just being a good scientist, then the more information that gets shared around, the better, surely. But actually, it seems like sometimes that can lead to sort of like bandwagoning onto false beliefs. Can you explain a little bit why the density of the network isn't always like maximal density isn't always good?
Yeah, and so this is work by Kevin Zollman, who's another philosopher of science that we discuss in the book. It's actually part of a much broader phenomenon where what you need in science and in epistemic communities is something we might call transient diversity, at least some period of time where people entertain different theories and engage in different sorts of research and tests. Because if you don't have that, then maybe you didn't test all the theories appropriately in a way that will allow you to find the best ones. So if everyone just thinks the same thing all the time, tries the same thing all the time, they're not going to discover new, better options. And so you want to have some diversity of practice in science to make sure that you are discovering these better options. In any epistemic community, you want that. You don't want to have too much diversity of practice because, of course, you don't want to keep testing theories forever when it looks like they're going to turn out pretty bad. So you want to have kind of the right balance between checking new things or things that seem weird or unlikely even, and then eventually settling on a good consensus. There's a bunch of different ways you can kind of get the right level of diversity. So one worry about people is that because we engage in conformity, because we learn from each other, because we have this strong social influence between each other, maybe we can be prone to too quickly settling on something without checking enough different options. And you see failures like that in science and in other kinds of epistemic groups. People worry about this a lot on juries. Like, did the jury all just jump to the same thing because a couple people said it and then everyone just kind of jumped on without really exploring the options enough? So one way that Kevin shows you can get this diversity of practice is having a disconnected network, or I should say a more loosely connected network. So one where people don't communicate so much. And so you can kind of have pockets of people exploring different options for enough time that they really find out about those options and then kind of settle on the best one. But there's other ways to get that kind of transient diversity. So you can have a community where you made an explicit agreement, like, we're going to just test a lot of things for a while and see what results we get. And if we test enough, then we can kind of settle on a consensus in a reasonable way without too quickly moving towards consensus. In this paper with my student, Nathan Gabriel, we show that if you add confirmation bias to networks, it can make the networks actually perform better, which is something actually that Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber argue in a different way, because it makes people stubborn. So confirmation bias makes them hold on to their beliefs longer, and that causes more transient diversity of exploration and practice. And then they spend more time on these different theories and then they settle on the right one. So there's like a lot of different mechanisms that can kind of get you to the, enough checking, enough diversity, of exploration.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it's related, I guess, to these ideas about the sort of wisdom of crowds. So, in order to take advantage of the wisdom of crowds, you often want people sort of reporting their beliefs independently, in parallel, rather than one person going first and then the next person saying what they think given what they just heard, and then the third person saying what they think given what they heard from the first two.
Mhm.
Because if people are able to sort of independently come up with their ideas, then they're not sort of infecting each other with information too early. And
Yeah.
I guess it's also related to what's sometimes said in the psychology and business literature on brainstorming. Like, if you want to brainstorm effectively as a group, everyone should first do it on their own and write down their ideas and then share them, rather than immediately going to like a group discussion.
Yeah. Though I'll point out there's like, so these things are related, but there's a slight distinction between these cases. So one is a case where you have a group, there's some amount of existing information in the group, and you don't want to set up a situation where that information gets lost as you aggregate the beliefs of the group, right? So you don't want people to vote out loud in order, because later ones won't share their information because now they're like, oh, there's already a consensus, I'll just follow that. So it's a that in that case, it's about making use of all the information that kind of already exists, and ditto the brainstorming case. In the kind of models that we're talking about, it's a system that's engaging in research and exploration right now. So they're going out to get information, but you don't want to create a situation where they cut off a whole practice of getting information because they're like, oh, that's not even promising, let's ignore that, and they do it sort of too early without checking it.
I see. Yeah. So if you compare it to like foraging, if you only forage in one of the four available places, then you never find out whether the second, third, or fourth is more promising.
Yeah, it has to do with this like explore exploit trade-off in learning. How much time do you spend exploring options versus exploiting them? And there's results from just every different discipline being like, okay, well, usually you need to kind of go somewhere in between, right? You need to explore enough to check all the options, but then you have to start exploiting. You can't explore forever. If you explore, but if you have to do some, like if you just start exploiting right away, you can never check and find that there's this great foraging option out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that points to something that in traditional epistemology is, again, just completely ignored, which is the opportunity costs associated with inquiry. Like, you can't pursue every available line of research simultaneously. You have to just pursue one or two. And that means that you won't be learning about the other ones at the same time. And with this sort of individualistic, time-stamped approach to knowledge, S knows that P, if and only if, blah, 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 it's impossible to even think about that kind of problem.
Mm-hmm. And that problem changes when you're in a social context too, where like often the ideal approach is to divide labor, to have some people explore some things, some people explore other things, and then share your information later.
Yeah, yeah, that's really valuable. Well, I want to end with the final chapter, which relates to less the sort of idealized scientist community and more real social networks. And I guess I'm of two minds about criticisms of, say, social media like Facebook and Twitter. On the one hand, it seems pretty clear that Facebook is a natural monopoly, and monopolies tend to be exploitative. And therefore, I think there are clear problems. Their business model is based on maximizing engagement to sell ads, and engagement doesn't always track epistemic value. So it seems like probably there are going to be some problems associated with it. But then I think about more traditional media, and those also have their problems. So I'm curious whether you think there are affordances in new media that actually create either quantitatively or qualitatively worse problems than existing ones from traditional media?
I mean, I think there's a couple things going on. One is that, like, if you look at the history of media, often the invention of a new type of media led to issues with misinformation and false beliefs, right? So, and then you'd see kind of cultural evolution to regulate those issues, right? You have printing now and the newspaper, and then you have a lot of yellow journalism, and then people get pissed off about that, and then they find out ways to develop reputable news sources and tamp down on lying in the news, for example. So you see responses to kind of like fix the problem, and I think you saw that with radio and TV. So in part, I think part of the issue is that traditional media has been around longer, and we've developed cultural norms, practices, laws, and regulations to keep it more trustworthy. But, and then we, get new social media that's enormously unregulated, right? And we see the same kind of explosion of these issues with misinformation and disinformation. But then I also think there are some things that are special about social media that make it particularly prone to epistemic issues. One being the kind of flexibility and rate of change in social media bodies, right? So as Facebook and Twitter grapple with misinformation on their platforms, WhatsApp and TikTok, and every new one, like every 6 months, there's a new app that has different structures for what kind of information gets shared and how people connect to each other, etc. And they have not yet grappled with how to deal with misinformation and disinformation, right? So that's one thing, is this rate of change issue. Another thing has to do with the enormous sort of flexibility of the internet vis-a-vis faking sources, right? So people use all these heuristics in deciding what to trust that has to do with what the source of that information is. But it's very easy on the internet to fake sources, right? To pretend to be an individual in, wherever, Brazil, when in fact you're a Russian agent. So that's like an extreme case. Or to pretend to be a real news source when you're not, or whatever it is. And so that is a new and different problem, because it didn't used to be quite so easy to set up profiles that would make you look like someone you're not, maybe someone that people should trust, when in fact you're not someone they should trust.
And I guess that's related to deep fakes and stuff like that, which are now emerging, and even ordinary people can create them pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, deepfakes, but really any misleading content it can be related to, right? So I can pose as someone in an animal lovers group and then start sharing misleading content, and I just look like another animal lover, when in fact maybe I have some other motivation. It's easier with social media platforms than it was before.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that someone can have multiple accounts that then make it look like there's a consensus when there isn't, if they've got a bunch of sock puppet accounts or something like that, that breaks down some of the mechanisms that we can normally rely upon to update our beliefs. Like consensus is actually a pretty good heuristic. But not if 90% of the accounts are owned by one person.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is that like content is produced by everyone, whereas if we look at most traditional media, it's hard to become a person who's producing content that's going to reach a lot of people. There's a relatively small number of people who are in that privileged space. Whereas with the internet and social media, anyone can create content that is available to anyone else. And so people with all sorts of nefarious goals or wacko beliefs can be creating and sharing content very widely.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to figure out how to regulate this stuff before the world ends.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, Cailin. I really appreciate it. And I'll share this with you after it's uploaded to the cloud.
Okay, nice talking to you, Mark. And Students, enjoy your class.
Thanks.